Welcome to the U.S. latest news channel. Watch the video to the end to find out the current and breaking news about the Russian war in Ukraine. The British Defense Ministry said in a statement, British authorities, Russian President Vladimir Putin's partial mobilization without holding any military equipment and inadequate training course taken over the army under the war with 300,000 comprehensive sent to the area of most intense claimed. Made by UK Ministry of Defence to update the army of soldiers for mobilization of groups of short-term intense training, and after training 300,000 soldiers that were sent to the area with old tech weapons, most of the war was announced. The allegations were not delayed by a response from an aide to Russian President Vladimir Putin. An aide to Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that 300,000 soldiers recruited into the army as part of the mobilization were sent to the borders of Russia, not to the most intense areas of the war, with adequate training, and that they are tasked with protecting Russia's borders. Anton Gerashenko, an advisor to Ukraine's interior minister, said in a video posted on his social media account that Russian troops recruited as part of the partial mobilization were given old and rusted weapons. In a video shared by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Army Tiger tank in a forest near the Donetsk region is Russian. 3 attack and 3 Tiger tanks were destroyed as a result of these attacks were Russian. The Ukrainian army continues to advance rapidly in the Donetsk region, where the referendum was held. Zelensky, Ukraine's president, according to the description of the Ukrainian army troops, also occupied Donetsk region around the town 7 received from the hands of the Russian army in the region Donetsk, Ukraine, as a result of the conduct of the civil 370 army were evacuated from the region. According to the latest statement of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the Ukrainian army is rapidly advancing in the Donetsk region, and civilians continue to be evacuated from towns and villages in the region. The General Staff also announced that 2,254 Russian tanks have been successfully destroyed since the invasion of Russia began. In another post on its social media account, the Ukrainian General Staff said that the Russian army had distributed 300,000 soldiers who joined the Russian army after the announcement of partial mobilization in order to use Russian tanks and weapons and equipment belonging to that period from the Soviet Union. Anton Gerashenko, advisor to the Minister of Interior of Ukraine, the scope of the partial mobilization share on your social media account received the equipment and weapons of Russian troops were deployed in the army during mobilization, and partial old claimed that soldiers who joined the army under 300.00 urged to lay down their weapons and surrender. Media outlets broadcasting in Europe have begun to report that Russian President Vladimir Putin has sent troops that he had recruited into the army as part of a partial mobilization to death. In Russia, part of the population continues to organize anti-mobilization demonstrations. At the same time, Russian citizens fleeing Russia continue to go to countries close to the border. The Donetsk attacks carried out by the Ukrainian army last Monday are continuing. As a result of the referendum held in the region, which was held on the instructions of Russian President Vladimir Putin, it is in question that the region will join the territory of Russia. As a result of the annexation of Donetsk, the region to Russian territory, any attack by the Ukrainian army on Donetsk, the region was announced by Russian state officials as an attack on Russian territory. Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia are among the regions and cities where the referendum will be decisively held. Some external sources claim that Russian President Vladimir Putin will use nuclear power as a result of the Ukrainian attacks that will occur after the referendum. In response to the allegations, the Russian Defense Ministry said that Russian President Vladimir Putin has no such plans and that a possible nuclear attack would damage all the territory in the region. According to reports by European media, Russian President Vladimir Putin is preparing for nuclear war. What do you think? In Russia, after President Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization, a 43-year-old Russian citizen who did not want to join the army burned himself. While protests and demonstrations continue to be held in Russia, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Russian citizens who fled the country due to the announced mobilization will have their citizenship revoked and will be punished with severe penalties by Russian courts. Tensions continue to rise in Russia. In a town in Russia, a commander supervising Russian citizens who were going to be conscripted as part of partial mobilization was shot by a Russian citizen who did not want to go to the army. While partial mobilization and anti-war demonstrations continue to be organized in Russia, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry in Donetsk said it was continuing to advance in its region and called on Russian troops stationed in the Donetsk region to lay down their weapons. As part of the partial mobilization, 300,000 troops who joined the Russian army were sent by the Russian army to be deployed on the borders. The invasion launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin against Ukraine at the end of February has received a great reaction around the world, and sanctions have been imposed on Russia by many countries. In addition to the reactions and sanctions, many countries did not break their ties with Russia and argued that Russia was right in the invasion of Ukraine. The invasion, which was launched in February, is about to enter its 8th month, and the resistance of the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian President Zelensky has caused a great echo in the world. U.S. President Joe Biden has announced that a coalition will be formed to isolate Russia from the world and put pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin to end the war. Russian President Vladimir Putin has said he wants to end the war, but the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian authorities do not want to end the war. Ukrainian President Zelensky said in a statement that the war cannot end until the territories occupied by the Russian army are cleared. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a statement that will call up soldiers who served in the Russian army as part of a partial mobilization, while announcing that referendums will be held, especially in the Russian-controlled Donetsk and Luhansk regions located in the east and south of Ukraine. European heads of state and heads of state of many countries have announced that they do not support the upcoming referendums and will not accept the results of the upcoming referendums, but Russian President Vladimir Putin also faced a backlash from his ally, Kazakh President Generis Tokayev. The Ministry of Dental Affairs of Kazakhstan recently announced that Russia will not recognize this result as a result of the referendum to be held in the east and south of Ukraine. Kazakh President Generis Tokayev said in a statement that he does not accept Russia's invasion of Ukraine and will not recognize the result of the referendum to be held, while Russia announced that it could take part in mediation talks to end the Ukrainian war. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has maintained diplomatic and economic relations with Russian President Vladimir Putin since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, said in an interview recently that Vladimir Putin was wrong in the occupation of Ukraine and that the regions that will be annexed to Russian territory as a result of referendums will not be recognized. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko said that the Belarusian army will not provide any assistance to Russia and does not support the invasion of Ukraine. A spokesman for the United Nations General Assembly said in a statement that Russia's aggressive position is not supported and that neutral countries in the first place have made calls and appeals for the end of the war. The Indian Foreign Minister has called for an investigation into Russian President Vladimir Putin for violations of human rights and international law. The Indian Foreign Minister continued his speech, saying that the Russian army has committed crimes against humanity in the occupied territories and the mass graves in the Ukrainian city of Bucha, saying that the Russian army has committed war crimes. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently announced that countries that are in close contact with Russian President Vladimir Putin no longer support Russian President Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Putin's positions. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi did not greet Russian President Vladimir Putin at the recent Heads of State Summit in Uzbekistan and refused to hug Putin. At the same time, Narendra Modi continues to make calls that Russia's invasion should be stopped. Russian President Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, refuses to take any step back in the face of calls and reactions. Russian officials say that Ukraine is ruled by the United States and that the region will be freed from Ukraine. India is an important power for Russian President Vladimir Putin because India regularly purchases oil and other resources from Russia. It turns out as a result of research that some of the sanctions imposed on Russia have lost their effect as a result of purchases made by India. Although India has not openly supported or approved the invasion launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin, it has continued to provide economic assistance to Russia since the start of the war. At the United Nations General Meeting held last week, Belarus, one of the countries considered an ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, said that it no longer supports Russia and called for an end to this war as soon as possible. China, which has constantly mentioned its closeness with Russia, has declared that Russia has committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine, will not recognize the results of the upcoming referendums, and Russian President Vladimir Putin should be tried. A well-known Russian media outlet that reports on Russian President Vladimir Putin and is known for its closeness to Vladimir Putin reacted to the fact that Russian citizens who were formerly in the Russian army were sent to Ukraine to fight as a result of Russian President Vladimir Putin's announcement of partial mobilization. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a special military operation in Ukraine on February 24th and announced partial mobilization in Russia last Wednesday due to the advance of the Ukrainian army. As part of the announced partial mobilization, compulsory military service affects only former soldiers up to the age of 35, non-commissioned officers up to the age of 50, and officers up to the age of 55. Who do you think will be the winner of the Russian-Ukrainian war? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.